The air outside the family shelter always smells like industrial floor wax and exhausted dreams. I was adjusting the zipper on my 6-year-old daughter Emma's puffy coat when a pristine black sedan glided to the curb. Out stepped my grandmother, Catherine, looking like she had just left a boardroom coup. She stared at the rusted sign above our heads, then at me. Her voice was cold and precise. "Taylor, why are you here? Why aren't you living in your house on Lake Travis?" I stood frozen, my mind racing through 3 years of survival. What house? Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own family? Like there was a whole life meant for you that you never got to see? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. Tears are a liability, and I had already spent my entire emotional budget on survival. I didn't ask a dozen frantic questions. Instead, I gripped the handle of the car door and pulled. The heavy thud of the door closing silenced the world outside, cutting off the smell of industrial cleaner and the distant sound of a siren. Inside, the air was filtered, cool, and smelled of expensive leather and old money, a world I hadn't stepped into for years. Emma climbed in first, her eyes wide as she touched the soft upholstery. I slid in beside her and immediately pulled out my phone. While Catherine sat with her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead with lethal precision, my fingers were already moving. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text my father. I went straight to our shared family monitoring app and revoked their access to my location and my bank alerts. I hit delete on the shared cloud storage where I had kept my portfolio. Then I opened a voice recording app and set it on the seat between us. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I watched the shelter disappear through the tinted glass, and I realized I had been the silent investor in my parents' version of family for far too long. 6 months ago, Elizabeth and Christopher sat me down at their kitchen table and told me it was time for me to become independent. They called it tough love. They said I was 28 years old and needed to stand on my own 2 feet for Emma's sake. They gave me a 30-day notice, but they didn't even wait for 2 weeks. I remembered coming home after a double shift at the firm, my brain half dead from calculating structural loads, only to find 2 cardboard boxes sitting in the hallway. The locks had been changed. When I knocked, my mother had cracked the door just an inch. She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied. "Plans change," she had whispered, while my daughter was curled up on the floor by the shoe rack, half asleep in her puffy coat. "Don't make a scene," my father had added from the shadows. For months, I believed them. I believed we were broke, that the family was struggling, and that my lack of a real house was a personal failure I had to own. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. I had been working to the point of exhaustion, funneling my architect's salary into what I thought were their emergency debts, while Emma and I hopped from motels to storage units just to keep a roof over our heads. But Catherine's question changed the math. The house on Lake Travis wasn't just a suggestion. It was a deed, a gift, meant to be my safety net. As the car sped toward the city, I realized my love for my parents hadn't been a bond. It had been a subscription, and I was finally footing the bill to cancel it. I wasn't just cold, I was calculated. By the time we reached the first red light, I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of their fallout. Catherine looked at me through the rear-view mirror, her eyes matching the icy clarity in my own. "By tonight," she murmured, "I will know exactly who signed for those keys." I nodded once. I didn't need to speak. The recording was already 5 minutes long, and my parents were already deep in debt to the truth. I watched the city lights flicker past the window, but my mind was stuck in a house of shadows that didn't even exist. I kept wondering, how did a woman who can calculate the wind load on a 40-story skyscraper end up sleeping in a storage unit? For years, my parents, Elizabeth and Christopher, had been the primary architects of my reality. They didn't use blueprints, they used whispers. "You're too emotional, Taylor. You're not good with money. You need us to protect you from yourself." I looked at Emma, who was quietly tracing the stitching on the car seat. When I was 12, My mother told me I was a phase, not a future. And back then, I believed her. That was the beginning of the invisible chains. People often ask why a victim of long-term abuse doesn't just walk away when the door is unlocked. They don't understand that the most effective prison doesn't have iron bars. This is what I call the trap of normalized cruelty. It's a psychological prison where your survival depends on your ability to minimize your own pain, to keep the peace. I wasn't being weak when I lived in that storage unit. I was being a survivor. My silence wasn't a lack of courage. It was a strategic choice to protect my daughter from the storm of my parents' disappointment. I had been conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to my utility. I was only family when I was paying their debts or fixing their messes. This wasn't a relationship. It was a high-interest loan I hadn't signed up for. My phone vibrated in my lap. A text from Elizabeth. "I heard Catherine found you. Don't you dare embarrass us with your drama. We've agreed you need to stop pestering your grandmother and learn some self-respect." Seconds later, she hearted the message. The same heart she uses when she's cutting me off at the knees. Anger didn't burn this time. It froze. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the old guilt, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family dynamic. It was a balance sheet, and I was finally looking at the red ink. For 4 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a respectable life while they were collecting the rent on my own legacy. The car slowed down as we pulled into the driveway of a hotel that looked like it cost more per night than I had made in a year. Catherine turned off the engine, and the silence was absolute. She didn't look at me, but I could see her reflection in the glass. "They've overdrafted their compassion, Taylor," she said, her voice like cold steel. "And the collection notice is coming." I didn't respond. I just opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of bank statements, property logs, and quiet retribution. I wasn't just an architect anymore. I was the auditor, and my parents were about to find out that their tough love was about to become an incredibly expensive lesson in criminal accounting. Catherine led me into a private conference room in her downtown office. It was all glass and white marble, a space designed for clarity and power. Adam, Catherine's lead attorney, was already there. He didn't offer me a platitude or a hug. He simply pushed a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice as sharp as his suit, "I have the audit you requested." I sat down and opened the folder. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were cold, focused. I didn't see my parents' faces in those pages. I saw data points. I realized I had been the silent investor in their version of family for years, footing the bill for a legacy I didn't even know I owned. Adam pointed to a line item from last August. The villa on Lake Travis was marketed as a luxury short-term rental, he said. I scanned the numbers. $35,000. That was the monthly revenue. My parents hadn't just taken the keys. They had built a business on my displacement. As an architect, I know how to read the bones of a structure. I know when a foundation is rotting long before the walls start to crack. Looking at these bank statements, I realized my relationship with Elizabeth and Christopher had never been built on love. It was a contract where they kept the profit, and I absorbed the debt. My affection had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades. I pulled out my own tablet and began sketching a floor plan of the Lake Travis property based on the rental photos. I wasn't drawing a home. I was mapping a crime scene. I calculated the total revenue they had collected over the past 4 years. $1,680,000. They have been diverting these funds to an offshore holding account, Adam said, his tone as clinical as a surgeon's. Specifically, an account controlled by Elizabeth and Christopher under a shell company called Austin Heritage Management. I didn't flinch. I just noted the numbers. This wasn't a family dispute. It was a systematic, professional betrayal. I looked at the signatures on the rental agreements. They were my parents' names, written with the confidence of people who thought I would never be in a room like this. My compassion had been a financial resource they exploited until the well ran dry. Now, the audit was complete. This wasn't about fixing a relationship anymore. You can't fix a foundation that was designed to fail from the start. I want a full accounting of every dollar, I told Adam. Every cent they took while my daughter slept in a storage unit. We aren't negotiating, we are collecting. Catherine watched me from the head of the table, her eyes matching the icy clarity in my own. She wasn't seeing a victim anymore. Grandmother was seeing the architect of a reckoning. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. Adam adjusted his tie, his movements as methodical as the case he was building. He pulled a secondary file from the portfolio, one that hadn't been part of the initial audit. "Taylor," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "we found the kill shot." He slid a notarized loan application across the marble table. The figure at the top was $1,500,000. I looked at the signature at the bottom. My name, Taylor Hart, was written in a clean, elegant hand. It was an almost perfect imitation of my own. But as an architect, I noticed the weight of a line. This signature was too heavy, too deliberate. It was a forgery. My parents hadn't just been pocketing the rent from the Lake Travis villa. They had used the property's equity to secure a massive loan behind my back. I didn't feel a surge of grief. Despair is for those who still have something to lose. I felt only a cold, analytical clarity. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for decades, and now they were looting the account. "Where did the money go?" I asked. My voice was clinical, as if I were discussing a budget overrun. Adam pointed to a series of wire transfers. "To an account in the name of Warren Collins. Your mother, Elizabeth's brother, the golden child of her generation, the man who had spent 40 years running from his own failures. Every time he crashed, my mother had been there to rebuild him, usually with resources she didn't own. They hadn't just displaced their granddaughter to a storage unit, they had sacrificed her entire legacy to save a man who had never spent a single day being responsible. I realized then that I was never a daughter to them. I was a credit limit. Our family wasn't a bond. It was a shell company designed to funnel resources to their real priority, Warren. I rubbed my eyes, not to wipe away tears, but to focus. This wasn't a breakdown. This was accounting. They had traded Emma's room for Warren's gambling debts. They had traded my hard work for his next fix. The kill shot had been delivered. This removed any remaining path to redemption for them. They weren't just toxic. They were criminals. They had engaged in a hostile takeover of my life, thinking I was too sensible to ever look at the books. They were wrong. I wasn't just cold anymore. I was lethal. "We have everything we need," Adam said. "This is bank fraud and identity theft on a massive scale." I looked at Catherine. She was standing by the window, the Austin skyline reflecting in her eyes like a map of a city she intended to conquer. "The gala is in 2 days," I said. "They're expecting to be celebrated." "They're expecting a performance?" Catherine turned, her expression matching the sharp, professional edge of my own. "Then we'll give them a show," she said. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask how they could do it. I just opened my laptop and started calculating the cost of the fallout. The accounting was finished. The reckoning was about to begin. The Austin Grand Ballroom was a sea of silk, champagne, and expensive lies. My parents, Elizabeth and Christopher, were at the center of it all, holding court near the ice sculpture, like they were the architects of the city's morality. They were smiling, accepting compliments on their philanthropy, while the $1,500,000 they had stolen from my daughter's future sat hidden in a web of forged signatures and offshore accounts. I stood at the back of the room, my simple navy dress, a stark contrast to the shimmering gold gown my mother wore, a gown likely paid for by the rent she collected, while I lived in a storage unit. I didn't feel nervous. I felt like a sniper. The room went quiet as Catherine stepped onto the stage. The guests expected a speech about legacy and charity. My parents straightened their shoulders, ready to bask in the reflected glow of her power. But Catherine didn't look at the microphone. She looked at Adam, who was already at the control booth. The lights dimmed, and the massive projector screen flickered to life. It didn't show a video of a new hospital wing. It showed a high-resolution photo of the rusted, padlocked door of the storage unit where Emma and I had spent the last 3 months. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Next came the slide that stopped the breathing in the room, a side-by-side comparison of my actual signature next to the forged signature on the $1,500,000 loan application. Then, a clear log of the monthly $35,000 rent payments from the Lake Travis villa being diverted directly into Elizabeth Hart Collins's private account. I watched my mother. The glass in her hand didn't just shake, it shattered on the marble floor. She looked around the room, but there were no allies left, only witnesses. Christopher turned toward the exit, but a uniformed officer was already standing there, a silent barrier to his escape. As I watched them shrink under the weight of the evidence, I realized I was witnessing a specific kind of psychological collapse. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For years, my parents had behaved as if their status was a part of their DNA, but it was actually just a costume they had rented from Catherine. They had mistaken having the material things they possessed for being the people they actually were. When the money was there, they felt like giants. But without the empty wallet being filled by my legacy, they had no internal value to hold them upright. They weren't shocked by the cruelty of what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. Their entire identity was a shell company, and I had just filed for its liquidation. Elizabeth scrambled toward the stage, her voice a shrill, desperate mess. "Catherine, please, Taylor, tell her, we're family, we did it for the family." She fell to her knees, reaching for the hem of my dress as I walked past her. I didn't pull away in a rage. I didn't scream. Anger is a waste of energy when you have the receipts. I looked down at her, my expression as cold and factual as the ledger on the screen. "You should have remembered we were family," I said, my voice carrying through the silent ballroom, "before you made a business out of my daughter's displacement." Adam stepped forward and handed Christopher a copy of the criminal complaint. My father looked at the papers like they were radioactive. "Do something, Taylor," he begged. "Please, don't let them take everything." "I already did," I whispered. I turned my back on the wreckage of their reputations and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the silence of the room was broken by the clinical click of handcuffs. Inside, my mind was already moving toward a different kind of architecture, one built on truth, not illusions. The accounting was over. The structure had fallen. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one standing in the rubble. It has been 6 months since the silence of the Austin Grand Ballroom was broken by the click of handcuffs and the shattering of my parents' carefully constructed lies. Now, the only sound I hear in the early morning is the gentle rhythm of Lake Travis against the shore and the quiet humming of my daughter, Emma, from the next room. She has her own bedroom now, with curtains she picked out herself and an art gallery of her drawings taped to the walls, not because we are hiding, but because we are finally home. The legal resolution was as sharp and decisive as Catherine's boardroom coups. Elizabeth and Christopher were convicted of identity theft and bank fraud. Given their age and lack of prior record, they received suspended sentences and 10 years of probation, but the financial restitution was absolute. The court ordered them to repay the full $1,500,000 from the forged loan and every cent of the $1,680,000 in rent they had pocketed over 4 years. To meet those numbers, they had to sell everything, the cars, the jewelry, and the townhouse they had used to look down on me. They are living in a modest rental now, far from the social circles that once fueled their ego. I sat at my drafting table today, looking over the blueprints for a new housing initiative I am designing. I realized then that my journey wasn't just about the accounting or the retaliation. People often think justice is only about the hammer, the justice of retribution that focuses on punishing the past. But there is a more powerful form, the justice of the sower. While retribution settles a debt, the sower builds a future. I used the restitution funds to establish the Lake Travis Heritage Fund. It doesn't just provide charity, it provides legal defense and professional placement for single mothers who have been financially exploited by their families. We are turning the money stolen from one daughter's legacy into the foundation for 1,000 others. I used to believe that being sensible meant staying quiet while my foundation was looted. I thought being a good daughter meant accepting the empty wallet they handed me. But I have learned that the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies. It is the construction of a life so bright that their shadows can no longer reach you. I am no longer the silent investor in their lies. I am the architect of my own peace. Every Sunday, Catherine visits us with pastries, and we sit on the deck watching the water. She doesn't talk about the gala or the audit. We talk about the future, about buildings that breathe, and a world that protects its most vulnerable. She told me once that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build while you're here. Looking at Emma running across the lawn, I finally know exactly what that means. This story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love is the courage to walk away from the people who tell you that you are nothing. If you are feeling like you are standing at the edge, invisible in your own family, know that your worth is not a transaction they get to control. You are the only person who can hold the pen to your own blueprints. Did I do the right thing by refusing to save them, or did I go too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you the strength to see your own worth, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to stay part of our community as we continue to seek justice and truth